Hi, everybody. My name is David Kramer, and I am, in addition to being a professor here, director of the library. You are participating in what is kind of an experimental event, in the sense that from the beginning of COVID, our book talk program went online. And people have gotten accustomed to that, the consequence of which you're actually witnessing in front of you. We wanted to do this in person. It's actually our first in-person book talk since before the beginning of the pandemic. We have a very active book talk program, but it is all online. And so you can see the results of the experiment. But the good news is that this is being recorded, and we have got a vast online audience, so it will be available. I got many, actually, inquiries before the fact saying, why aren't you simulcasting this? And my response was, don't worry, right? We want people to come because we're doing it in person, but are recording it and it will be available to you afterwards. And so this will have an afterlife if you are watching this. Not live, but in the recording. I welcome you as well, and I can tell all of you, whether here present or watching after the fact, that you're in for a treat because this is a very important publication by two very distinguished people. So let me do the official introduction. Everybody's got your phones off? I don't know, okay. Those of you who are at home watching it after, you can do whatever you want, right? Enjoy your pizza, it's just fun. We've got artist and philosopher, both contributing to this magnificent work. Debra Band. I'm going to do I'm sorry, I know how I feel when people do this for me, like the official bios, but got to put it on record, right? Debra Band's work in Hebrew illuminated manuscripts draws upon her love of both the manuscript arts and biblical studies. We in the library believe in those things. That's great. Descended from an eminent rabbinic family, her extensive studies of Jewish texts and research into medieval European and Middle European painting and manuscripts inform her work. Her work, celebrated for its intellectual and spiritual depth as well as visual beauty, includes illuminated and paper-cut books and ketubot, other manuscript pieces and paper cuts in exhibits, private collections, and community institutions and galleries across the world. Debra is artist and author of Song of Songs, The Honeybee in the Garden, I Will Wake at Dawn, Illuminated Psalms, and Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth, and Hannah, Kabbalat Shabbat, The Grand Unification, and her first illuminated book for children, All the World Praises You, an illuminated alphabet book. I have to get that for my grandchildren.
I'll send you.
Okay, excellent. She is presently collaborating, as you know, you're here, with Philosopher Menachem Fisch on an illuminated book and commentary on Qohelet, and with scholar of Jewish mysticism. This sounds really interesting. Art Green and astrophysicist Howard Smith on an illuminated book and commentary on the 16th century Kabbalistic work about creation. When will that be available?
Hopefully within about a year.
Fabulous. Oh, can't wait for that. And Menachem Fisch, I have to just say a word personally before doing the official reading. I was first introduced, not personally, but indirectly through writing to Menachem Fisch upon the publication of this book, Rational Rabbis, in 1997. And the minute I picked it up and started reading, I began hitting myself out of lament, that old-fashioned way of lamenting, out of lament that the book had not been available to me when I was writing and publishing my book, The Mind of the Talmud, back in 1990. But as you can see from the little yellow sticky things, I've read it carefully and cited often and with great approval in my more recent history of the Talmud. This is not self-promotion. It's about, promoting the fellow right over here. So now the official. Menachem Fisch is Joseph and Seal Mazer, Professor Emeritus of History and Philosophy of Science, Director of Center for Religious and Interreligious Studies at Tel Aviv University. He is former president of the Israel Society for History and Philosophy of Science and former chair of the National Committee for History and Philosophy of Science at the Israel Academy of Science. He's published widely on the history of 19th century British science, mathematics, on confirmation theory and rationality, on the theology of Talmudic literature, on the philosophy of Talmudic legal reasoning. His recent work explores the limits of normative self-criticism, the Talmud's dispute of religiosity, the possibilities of articulating a pluralist political philosophy from within the assumptions of halachic Judaism, the history and philosophy of scientific framework transitions, and the theopolitical roots of Israel's reaction against political Zionism. And on a more personal level, I hope this doesn't embarrass you, when the announcement was made of your speaking here, one of my colleagues came up to me and told me that you were known, maybe as a graduate student, for sitting out at the lawn at, what was it, Bar Ilan, right, with a guitar, surrounded by many approving females. So I don't know what she did, with that information, but anyhow, it's a pleasure, again, to be joined both in person and online. And I will just add that if you are finding yourself in these weeks puzzling about the great questions of what it means to be as a human being living in a world where human beings are just too human, right? And I mean that in the multiple senses of the term. There is no better place to begin to look for wisdom than in Qohelet. So this is not only a wonderful treat to be able to hear this, but I think right to the point of our experience in these very challenging days.
Well, thank you, David, for that introduction. Thank you, David, for making this event happen. I always tried to keep the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde parts of me separated. You introduced them to each other. And thank you, Debbie, for the this roller coaster of the last 3 years of studying Kohelet intensely together and entering a dialogue with the medium, which was so strange to me, and coming up with a dialogue about Kohelet, across the great divide of art and philosophy. So, nothing in our book or in what I'll say today will help to identify Kohelet's actual author or those responsible for its actual canonization. What I shall address is the theological question of Kohelet's biblical status by a reading which I hope you'll be convinced does justice to the text as a sufficiently pertinent religious deliberation, a reading that will also explain its curious liturgical placing at the end. R.B.Y. Scott's memorable Anchor Bible volume deems Qohelet the strangest book in the Bible, whose presence in it is most inexplicable because it diverges too radically from the law and the prophets, denying some of the things on which they lay the greatest stress. Qohelet acknowledges there being one God in heaven who judges all, but makes no mention of divine covenant, law, or revelation. From which Alan Mittelman concludes in his recent book that if Qohelet knows of divine revelation, he brackets its importance or relevance. Now, I read Qohelet not as a religious thinker ignorant or indifferent to divine revelation, but as a thinker grappling with a religious problem he believes must be addressed prior to heeding to God's word. Any viable reading of Qohelet must be clear about the book's overall premise and subsequent question, which are both posed in verses 2 and 3. The premise is that all but all is Hevel. Now, I'll leave that word untranslated. All but all is Hevel, a word repeated 5 times in the course of that one opening verse. And the question is what Yitaron, again I'll leave that word untranslated, has a man of all his labor, wherein he labors under the sun. If all is Hevel, what yitaron can any human endeavor boast to have under the sun? Now, the word all, repeated in both verses, implies that Qohelet is concerned with the possible yitaron, whatever that word means, of any human undertaking. Of the two terms, Hevel and yitaron is the more straightforward, taken invariably as profit, advantage, or value, or as Mittelman suggests, echoing the Latin amplius, what remains, manotar. But the question of yitaron changes significantly according to how one understands Hevel. Following the Vulgate vanitas, most read Hevel as meaninglessness, emptiness, futility, even absurdity, as Fox's famous reading, which renders Qohelet's question rhetorical. If anything a person can ever think or do amounts to nothingness and futility, what value indeed can any human undertaking ever boast? Qohelet is hence read by many as proving the worthlessness of all human effort and as advocating, say on the basis of chapter 9, taking pleasure in life while one can, while on the basis of 12, fearing God and obeying his command. Even the best of such readings, like those of my late father Harold Fisch or Alan Mittelman, leave much of the text unattended to. The curious change of tone at the beginning of chapter 3, which I'll address, the sober counsels listed in the end of 6 and all through 7, the political musings of chapter 4, the wise farmer of chapter 11, and more. So I read Qohelet's Hevel premise differently. The term is indeed employed, and Ben, I'd appreciate you attesting to this. The term Hevel is employed in the Bible indeed to denote meaninglessness and futility, but only with respect to idolatry and idolaters. Okay? When applied to human life, it is employed to connote mist-like temporality, which, unlike idolatry, is neither meaningless, futile, nor absurd. And because applied in Qohelet not only to the human lifespan, but to human understanding and to human undertaking, I take Hevel as deeming them to be not only transient and temporary, but wholly temporal, not merely fleeting, but as inherently time-bound, as the children of their time and place. Qohelet's question then becomes this: if all we can ever claim to know or achieve is forever time-bound, if what we deem undeniably true or good today may be well denied tomorrow, if we can never be sure of what we are sure, what could ever count as an undertaking of proven worth? That's not a rhetorical question. How, under conditions of perpetual doubt and radical diversity of opinion, can we lead a life whose value we can vouch for? The next 8 verses restate the question in terms of the dismal incongruity between what, as philosophers dub, ontology and epistemology, between nature's timeless, perfect, law-governed cycles in gold and our time-bound and hence wholly inadequate attempts to picture it in white. Hopelessly culture-dependent, the very words by which humans perceive what they see and hear can never capture nature's laws' timeless validity. So doomed to live our lives in a world we can never properly understand, what we see as new developments have, I quote, already been in the ages before us. For in reality, there is nothing new under the sun, and hence there can be no remembrance. Accumulating time-bound picturing can never yield a timeless portrayal. At which point Qohelet switches to the first person. from reporting in the third person the words of Qohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem, to the tortured personal testimony of a profound religious thinker who gave his heart to seek by wisdom concerning all things done under the heaven rather than under the sun. Okay, tachat hashamayim, not tachat hashamish. And finding that God has given man to be exercised by, la'anot bo, to be a bad, even an evil matter, inyan ra in Hebrew, is far harsher than the usual English translation. Kohelet's new religious idiom is captured powerfully by mention of what has given us to contend with, Mashenatan Elohim lanu, which strongly implies, certainly to the Hebrew reader, that the fundamental discrepancy between reality and our ability to comprehend it is not diminished by divine revelation. And the two book metaphors comes to mind, that of nature and that of scripture, both divinely authored in timeless perfection that wholly transcend the ever-changing vagaries of human understanding, and therefore ungraspable as such by those he made responsible for his world and the covenantal recipients of his word. Oblivious to the very standards by which we are expected to abide and be judged, how can we prudently subject ourselves to God's will if we can never know it? This states an anxious and distraught Kohelet is the evil, crushing matter inyan ra we are obliged by God to respond to. La'anot bo is to be tortured and to respond. The Hebrew is that's a loaded term. And therefore incapable, respond to in tortured realization of our total inadequacy to do so. But what causes Kohelet to realize the full horror of his predicament are his two dismally failed attempts to undermine it. Being of supreme wisdom, he states, speaking as King Solomon, I set upon a keen study of human wisdom itself, lada'at chokhmah, to know wisdom itself, hoping to achieve a certain understanding, but to no avail. Even the wisest of humans is only humanly wise, and therefore incapable of surpassing reason's inherent time-boundness. Much wisdom is much anger. Bechokmah marbe kas, and he that increases knowledge increases pain, machov. Again, the Hebrew is far harsher than any of the English translations I know. And what cannot be achieved by the wisest words cannot be achieved by the best of works. Chapter 2 portrays Solomon's Jerusalem as a paradigm of utilitarian morality, not merely a story of an immensely rich man's success, but that of a king who achieved more for his country than any before him. Yet the decades of unmatched Solomonic peace and prosperity, satisfying while they last, are no less transient than Solomon's wisdom. The devastating conclusion is that even the best of human efforts, intellectual or social, is irredeemably worthless in absolute divine terms. And the depths of Kohelet's despair know no limit and have no parallel in the biblical literature, causing him to hate life and to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. Thus ends chapter 2. But this is not where Kohelet's argument terminates, as many have it. This is where it begins. The contrast between the dark loathing of life at the end of chapter 2 and the buoyant optimism of the Song of Seasons, put to the upbeat music of Pete Seeger, which Debra will mention, that opens chapter 3 is dramatic. In realizing that for everything there's a season and a time for every purpose, chefetz, under the heaven, Kohelet seems to reach an understanding that enables him to re-embrace life and to revisit almost verbatim the heart-gripping quandary from which he set forth in chapter 1. Yet without a trace of anger, cast, without a trace of bitterness, he now sees the task which God has given us to contend, but he no longer deems it a painful or evil matter, no longer an inyan ra. To understand Qohelet's sea change, a theological word is in order. Qohelet's God is not an abstract idea. He's the perfect creator and judge, whose ways are humanly unknowable, despite being immanently present in each of our lives, holding us accountable for living up to expectations. Now, adding the God axiom, if I may call it so, to the mix, transforms the problem of making a meaningful difference to a world we cannot fully understand to that of being held accountable by a judge whose transcendent standards we can never know, rendered devastating, as I said, by the end of chapter 2. What I believe Qohelet realizes with a jolt at the opening of 3 is that what I dubbed his God axiom borders on an oxymoron. God's timeless ways and perfect norms are indeed humanly unknowable, but to hold us accountable to standards we are incapable of knowing constitutes a violation of God's perfect justice. Because he cannot but be aware of our inherent time-boundness, in other words, that all is created in time. For everything there is a season, a time. It is unthinkable that he'd hold us to his perfect standards. The biblical term chefetz means will or desire. In Kohelet, it's applied exclusively to God, to God's will, to God's expectations. I therefore read 3's opening verse thus: because God created everything in time, there must also be a time for every divine desire and expectation under heaven. God will judge us not by his timeless standards, but by the quality of our time-bound assessments. He does not expect us to arrive at absolute criteria for planting, building, or waging war, but to do our time-bound best to decide if it is now the time to plant or to uproot, to kill or heal, to wage war or to make peace. The worth of human understanding and undertaking will be judged by God in humanly recognizable time-bound terms. With a great sigh of relief, Qohelet realizes that the task we face is no longer devastating. God has set everything beautiful in time, et hakol asa yafeh be'ito, right? And has also given, Natan again, given the world in our heart, but in a way that no man can comprehend his work from the beginning to the end. We are expected to do our best. We are expected to do our best knowing that God will hold us accountable only to humanly knowable standards. Qohelet's problem is thus morphed into that of making good tentative decisions to do good that one can rejoice in, lismoach bo. And I read that this is the third technical term in Qohelet, simcha, not as mirth or pleasure or taking pleasure, but the satisfaction, lismoach lirot tov, the satisfaction in doing good. Referring back to the world we cannot grasp, Qohelet enables today's reader, you guys, to appreciate his change of heart. The very idea of a proven scientific truth we now realize is a conceit. Scientific laws cannot be proved. Scientists form hypotheses, test them, and replace them when found wanting. At its uttermost best, science remains forever tentative and fallible and time-bound. Yet none would consider science absurd or futile. Kohelet will extend this insight to all serious human judgment and attempt to determine what amounts to doing one's humanly best in this regard. But some preliminaries he needs to deal with first. Two positions Kohelet deems stupid. The overpious, who rely passively on divine providence and retribution, rather than risk erring by taking responsibility for their world. And the overwise, the uberwise, who haughtily deny the Hevel premise and proceed dogmatically, confusing feeling certain with certainty. Kohelet has no patience with either category of fools that keep popping up in subsequent chapters in one guise or another. Chapter 4 combats the political problem raised by the Hevel premise. How to prevent society from being torn apart by its members' inevitably diverse, culture-specific, time-bound ideas of the good. His ingenious answer is that social cooperation does not require normative consensus or, as in Hobbes's Leviathan, surrender to the Leviathan, to the sovereign. That stable social cohesion can be achieved by agreeing that to stand together in the face of natural hazards and human menace is always preferable to standing alone, even if we disagree on normative matters of what's good and what's not good. Chapters 5 and 6 warn first against identifying a worthy life with ardent vertical ritual observance, shmor raglecha kasher tavo, and so on. And second, against gauging our project's value, worth, or profit, yitaron, with material gain, and lending these terms commercial meaning. Qohelet understands the temptation of reducing the worthy to material worth and argues firmly against it. It is a retrospective rather than a prospective measure of worthiness, rendering ongoing and failed projects worthless regardless of what their failure owed to. As in game theoretic models of rationality, some of you may be familiar with it, reducing rectitude to utility is highly worrying. Qohelet embarks on his own positive account of wise human conduct with a powerful, if largely misread, image at the end of 6. What yitaron has the man more than the fool? He asks. Okay? Now, the translation of his answer, for what advantage has the wise more than the fool? What has the poor man who knows how to make his way among the living? What on earth does that mean? But the terms in Hebrew, ma le'ani, hayodea lahaloch, lo lahalech or lahaloch, neged hachayim. Hachayim in Qohelet doesn't have to mean the living. It can mean life itself. Re'eh chayim mimisha asher ahavta. So I prefer translating what yitaron has the wise man more than the fool, what a poor man has who knows how to go against his life. Critical of their life and determined to change it, poor people assume responsibility for their lives by imagining ways to improve it, which they also criticize before settling on a way forward, keenly combining value judgment and informed speculation. Okay? Halach ruach. They apply their standards of propriety to exposing what they deem wrong and imagine putting right, knowing that they are liable to err, and even if right, unsuccessful. But Qohelet also knows that even the wisest are poor self-critics. Because we use our norms to criticize, we are incapable of holding them in critical check. This is where the normative diversity of a Qohelet wise society emerges as an asset. Chapter 7 is about enhancing self-critical reflection by self-exposure, deliberate self-exposure to similarly trying situations and to the normative critique of people committed differently. Better to seek a good name among people than precious ointment, to go to houses of mourning than to follow fools to those of mirth, to seek the rebuke of the wise than the praise of fools, and so forth. It ends with a sobering reflection on how even general maxims considered undeniably valid, such as to forever avoid the company of certain types of corrupt women, are never ever applicable in certainty. We can take this point up in discussion if you want. Chapter 8 explores the limits of accountability as when weighing personal risk against standing up to a monarch one considers wrong. Qohelet is adamant that God does not hold us responsible for wrongs we cannot prevent, although one can never be sure how to draw that line. He then dismisses two familiar reactions to seemingly unpunished evil. Those who see in it proof of divine injustice, and those as proof that such evil is good, for vainly presuming to know God's final judgment. Chapter 9 is the only rival position, engages the only rival position Qohelet takes seriously. Benign hedonists who fully accept Qohelet's analysis, yet see no sense in adopting the anxious, perpetually self-doubting life Qohelet prescribes, and opt rationally to best enjoy their brief respite on earth instead. Indeed, counters Qohelet, we never know when disaster will strike. We never know when disaster will strike, but predicting and preparing for it are two different things. Those Qohelet deems wise will have studied such calamities and planned for them as best they can. They will be in a position to save the city. Pleasure-bound societies will not only be unprepared, but will have no room for such permanently misanthropic party poopers. Wretched and rejected, they will go unheeded. Chapters 10 and 11 set two powerful portrayals side by side, an Aristophanic dystopia of a city run by fools, set against a powerful example of human wisdom at its best in the form of a Qohelet-wise farmer tilling his field in the face of uncertainty, and Debra has a wonderful image, as you will see, depicting that. Having solved the problem for which he anxiously set forth, Qohelet can declare to his readers, in deliberate contrast to the dark despair of chapter 2, that raising our eyes from our human vantage point under the sun, truly the light is sweet, and a pleasant thing it is for the eyes to behold the sun. No longer crushed by the insurmountable chasm between God in heaven and we upon the earth, we have come to understand our position under the sun and to behold it as holding, despite our inherent time-boundedness, real promise for a divinely approved life, wisely led and worth living. Qohelet can finally, calmly face death, not as a denial of life's worth, but as a natural development, tenderly describing us departing this world, accompanied by the equally transient, soon-to-be outmoded fruits of our accomplishments. As my late father Harold Fisch aptly writes, never has there a gentler poem on the approach of death been written. Death becomes the beauty of a golden sunset as the dust returns to the earth and the spirit to meet its maker. In the light of this reading, Qohelet's 4 last verses need not be read as a later apologetic appendage. As I noted, there is much to suggest that Qohelet viewed the problem of worthy accomplishment in the face of human time-boundedness as applying equally to both tasks that God has given the sons of man to be exercised by, to making sense of both divinely authored books, the book of nature, and that of his revealed world. Verse 11 suggestively deems the words of the wise to be given by the one shepherd, referring to them as originating in God and spoken in collections addressed to audiences or deliberated in study sessions. And the Talmud, Chagiga Gimel Amud Bet, reads this very verse as advocating the radical diversity of rabbinic opinion as the God-sanctioned master norm of Torah study, much in line with how I read Kohelet. And that's a topic for another talk. All you have to do is whistle, David. The next verse warns against vainly attempting to render one inevitably tentative findings permanent by committing them to writing, which again dovetails nicely with the rabbinic distinction between the written and the oral Torah, Torah shebichtav, Torah sheba'al peh. And at the end of the matter, when all is said and done, we can confidently fear God and keep his commandments, not because we can claim to know them for certain, but because we can confidently claim to have done our humanly best to work them out for now. That being the whole duty of man, kizeh kol ha'adam, and on that basis God will bring our every work into judgment. At the very end of our book, when all is said and done, I briefly address Kohelet's liturgical placement, which I don't have to tell you, is ritually read during the Festival of Tabernacles, Sukkot, which is deemed by the rabbis to be the most joyous of Jewish festivals. Sukkot is, of course, dedicated first and foremost to leaving our permanent dwellings and taking up residence in temporary, unstable booths, a celebration of our essential temporality, time-boundedness, and transience, if you wish, and expressing our joyful satisfaction by rendering of simcha in knowing that we can pursue divinely sanctioned lives of real value despite the thoroughgoing impermanence of our very existence. Thank you so very much. Over to you.
Lovely. It's a pleasure to be back at JTS and share this project, which is a realization of a 30-year plus obsession. I'm so grateful to Professor Kramer for inviting us, and I also have to thank Sharon and Stephen Lieberman from my community in Potomac for their generous support for the publication of this work, the latest in many years of support for my work. My first conversation with Kohelet was triggered by a family tragedy during the week of Sukkot when I was 31. The previous week, I had heard the phone ring as I returned from the evening services beginning Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre. Alarmingly, for she wouldn't ordinarily touch electronics on a festival, I heard my mother's voice through the answering machine. I grabbed the phone and heard her cry that my stepbrother Jonathan, only a few months older than I, we'd been quite close, lay in hospital dying from brain trauma suffered in a traffic accident that afternoon. I managed to arrive home in Montreal in time for the funeral and entered a maelstrom of shock and grief that I had never yet experienced, although the near death of my second child soon after birth the previous year had been a near miss. Now, the Shiva mourning period was, of course, cut short by Sukkot, but the family continued to gather at the home with his wife and toddler children after synagogue services. One evening, I returned to my parents' home before the others and picked Qohelet off of their library bookshelf. I cannot at all remember what drew me to it. Maybe this was the Saturday evening after its annual chanting in synagogue, but I spent the rest of the evening circling their foyer, gripping this book, my eyes glued to Kohelet's words. Now, I want you to know that before that night, I had dutifully followed the annual chanting of Kohelet, but never paid much attention to it. But now, the phrase, "Oh, he understands how random, how arbitrary death can be," reverberated in my head and never faded. Many years have passed since that night, crowded, as for many of us, with both intense joy and terrible grief, and throughout Kohelet has stayed with me. That first evening, I absorbed some sense of his understanding that we all live subject to an inscrutable divine will, and the best we can do is to live every moment as well, as deeply and intentionally as we can, while we can, for life can vanish. I'd only just begun my work in Hebrew illuminated manuscripts then, but my itch to explore Kohelet took hold that night. I made a couple of false starts at it, but knew that Kohelet was saying something far more than I was understanding. It was about 25 years later at a Shabbat dinner at Menachem and his wife Chana's home during a Meet the Family trip to Israel, shortly after my husband's and my wedding. Menachem and I are second cousins. When Menachem casually asked me about my plans for my next project, I was in the middle of my Kabbalat Shabbat book at that point, I shook my head and replied that I really wanted to work on Kohelet, but had wandered into a fog bank each time I tried. "Oh, I've written on Kohelet," he said. "Let me send you the article." The following week, I downloaded and devoured it, and lo, light suddenly began to pierce the mists. Menachem adventurously agreed to discuss a joint project, although he was somewhat puzzled about how one might possibly visualize this abstract text. But that's my job. Now, you might well ask, well, very nice, but what's the point of this archaic medium altogether, now in the era of never mind printing, but the internet and AI? Let me answer this today by sharing with you the ways that I approach the creation of modern Hebrew illuminated manuscripts, and then showing you some of the 60 illuminations themselves. You'll see that an illuminated manuscript can do far more to enhance the aesthetics and emotions of a reader's experience, but actually interpret and amplify the meaning of the text. Here, a leisurely, contemplative gaze at its imagery brings to human level complex ideas about Kohelet's intent, as Menachem has revealed it, and detects the reverberations of this odd but vital text, not only across the Jewish culture that produced, protected, and cherished it, but also across surrounding Western civilization. A painting, or a sculpture for that matter, can communicate dozens of ideas instantly. And an illumination also ties us to 2 millennia of our history beautifully. This 1434 painting, which I'm sure many of you know, is from the hand of an artist who came out of the tradition of illuminated manuscripts. Now, this painting has taught me almost everything I know about building the meaning of a painting. I work daily under a reproduction, and to visit with it in the National Gallery is just about my first stop on even the briefest trip to London. The religious and ethical value of every single item you see here adds up to a detailed moral and ethical marriage contract between 2 15th century young people, not just a fusion of 2 Florentine banking families. Just a few examples. The dog represents fidelity, the sabots, the clogs, the protection from the elements, the single candle glowing in the chandelier, the light of Jesus, and under the mirror, the artist's witness, Jan van Eyck, was here. Now, obviously, literally, that's what it is in Latin. Now, obviously, since I work within the Jewish tradition, my imagery is very different from that of 15th century Christianity. Mine is based in other biblical texts, colorful exegesis from many rabbinic sources, and many avenues of Western thought and science. One of my challenges over 3 decades has been to develop a modern Jewish iconographic vocabulary capable of teasing out abstract concepts in visual form. Following the lead of Van Eyck, as analyzed by Erwin Panofsky, I create disguised symbolism in a scene that usually makes logical sense, all explained in commentaries in each book. How do I construct my visual interpretations? Moshe Halbertal has described Jewish culture as a text-centered community. And my own interpretive work is nothing if not text-centered. Each project begins with some years studying the chosen text, in this case Kohelet, along with its rabbinic commentaries and modern academic Bible studies. Incidentally, the Roman and Byzantine era rabbis clearly understood Kohelet, but were demonstrably uncomfortable with its implications. And so my ability to rely on the early rabbinics for Kohelet for imagery has been limited. There are also regular discussions with my collaborators. Menachem and I worked together by Zoom. I begin each painting by writing, and as I consider each passage, many more associations spring to mind, and I develop a mental picture of where I want to go. I rarely sketch these anymore. The layout happens in my mind. And then I set to work, laying out text and micrography first, proofing, then painting in gouache, and finally gilding. And since one always sees a 2-page spread in a book, I paint both facing illuminations together. Here, I base my visual interpretation on Menachem's Hevel premise, that the human lifespan is short, and not only we, but all our discrete deeds are transient. Nothing lasts forever. And separated as we are from the divine, we cannot possibly fathom God's expectations of us, although we know we ultimately face divine judgment. Let me show you how some of these visual interpretations of Kohelet work. You see here a painting of the Alhambra on its ridge in Granada. The micrographic border surrounding the painting presents roughly the first third of Kohelet. You'll see the remainder in the next slide. Why the Alhambra? This corresponds to Menachem's Hevel premise. Our grandest, most exquisite monuments are ephemeral, just as our lives and endeavors. And of course, Kohelet dons the cloak of the great Solomon, kind of an avatar, as he analyzes the human condition. In the paintings ahead, I compare human life and deeds, labors, as Kohelet would say, to a grand and gorgeous palace full of lives bursting with action and conversation, beauty and tragedy. Yet even this grandeur will crumble in time. The palace metaphor draws upon a tradition common in Midrash, comparing the heavens to a palace, the human world to an orchard or garden. I extend the metaphor to human life and deeds, and what grander palace than the Alhambra of the wonderfully beautiful medieval palace and gardens of the Muslim Nazarite rulers of Granada. The Alhambra also hosted much of the vibrant, poetry-filled court life of the medieval Spanish or Sephardi community. And yet, for all its glory, all the almost audible ghosts of the glittering and powerful people who strode its expanses, if you look into the corners of its mosaic-encrusted walls, if you look at the stonework lining its garden paths, you see that even this mass of glory crumbles slowly into the red dust from which it arose. The golden rim of the painting alludes to the golden bowl in the 12th chapter, not yet cracked here, and haunts the entire manuscript. So while the Alhambra provides the setting and the central metaphor, I flesh out the sense of the fragile and fugitive beauty of human experience with an iconography drawn from related biblical and other Jewish texts, from archaeology, the natural world, science, and far more modern icons relating to issues that Kohelet explores. I include poetry and prose not only from the Hebrew Bible, but across Western civilization to help reveal the enduring reality of Kohelet's thought across millennia and landscapes far from his own. An area of mist penetrates every painting, always reminding us of the ephemerality of all human deeds. I introduce all of these to conjure up a visual midrash probing Kohelet's struggle to understand the workings of the universe, to find wisdom, what God demands of us, despite our transience and vantage point under the sun. On the Hebrew page, the philosopher's eye, Menachem's, peers through the initial letter. The plain clay jar spilling the jewels that tumble down around the words describes, in a midrash quoted for each of the books attributed to Solomon, that wise king's unsealing of the wisdom of Torah. The rabbis compare the Torah to a seal jar full of jewels, but only when opened and spilled could the riches be found. This was Solomon when he composed Kohelet. And I'll leave you to explore the meaning of the English painting in the book. The philosopher compares the immutable cycle of life to the daily journey of the sun, and to the water cycle. All three beyond the reach of human will and action, or at least until recently. The mosaic repeats its own complex, man-made pattern endlessly, in colors that echo the sea, sky, sunlight, and forests. Outside, ephemeral mist, Hevel, rises from the gardens below into the clouds, only to fall to land and sea as rain. The cloud of micrographic text in the Hebrew illumination includes passages of the 11th century Spanish Jewish philosopher and poet Shlomo ibn Gabirol's Neoplatonic philosophical tract in verse, the Royal Crown, Keter Malchut. He incidentally lived and worked in the Alhambra for some time. The first passage ponders our inability to comprehend God's eternity. The second laments the clouds of human imperfection that obscure humanity's view of divine wisdom, which is likened here to light. Gazing from his high tower, the omnipotent ruler struggles to accept that he cannot rise from under the sun to perceive divine wisdom. He despairs of the ephemerality of even his rich and powerful life. The Hebrew ani, I, rests upon a regal carpet, while the glittering gold between the lines fit for a royal manuscript seem to ridicule the earthbound philosopher's inability to find heavenly wisdom. The English pronoun I rests upon a clay bulla of the Judean royal seal. The balustrade upon which he rests is from the ruins of the Judean palace at Ramat Rachel, hinting at the monumental palace that Qohelet's Solomon avatar inhabits. Now, in the background, we see a Hubble Space Telescope image, see it there, of the ultra-deep field of space, which I've long used to symbolize God's invisible but all-suffusing presence, and in this book, to allude to how every particle of our world cycles endlessly through the stars. Can one find wisdom by indulging in luxury? Qohelet's sensual pleasure and pride in his material achievements are clouded by his realization that all his luxuries, all his accomplishments for his people will evaporate. In the Hebrew illumination, Qohelet gazes upon his irrigated orchards and vineyards. This Persian period philosopher would already associate water flowing in this arid land with the wisdom of Torah, a ubiquitous metaphor found throughout the prophets and the writings. The cherry branches, emblematic of the seat of American power in Washington, D.C., where these illuminations were painted, progress through their annual cycle, reminding him of the passing of generations. Despite Qohelet's pride in all the beauty he's amassed, the drifting fog reminds him of the ephemerality of all his wealth here under the sun. Okay, just a few words about these paintings of perhaps the most beloved part of Qohelet. At right, with the first verse of the chapter, the philosopher king gazes into a garden pond, again alluding to the golden ball of chapter 12, not yet cracked. Qohelet begins to find comfort in human limitations on wisdom as he meditates further on how every situation in life has its moment, even if that moment is unknowable to any but God. He perceives life as a stream, its beginning and end obscure, always subject to sudden turbulence. The little mosaic at the top bears a fragment of the musical notation of what else but Pete Seeger's famous, it has to be here, famous 1965 song setting of the poem Turn, Turn, Turn. And now for something completely different. Qohelet turns to consider the foolishness of oppressors and plutocrats in the face of both human and divine authority. The human illumination presents the ancient flail and sword, while the English illumination begins with a far more modern tool of oppression. Coins spill everywhere. Again, the starlit heavens of the Hubble image, again, divine intent obscured from human view by clouds of mist. Qohelet ends his warnings about irresponsible actions with this assurance that God wants humankind to live happily, taking pleasure in our work, fully enjoying its fruits throughout our days. This, he asserts, is the wisdom vouchsafed to humankind under the heavens. The illuminations offer each text within a golden triangle, the Greek letter delta that signifies mathematical concepts of change. The animals surrounding the text allude to this exhortation in the Talmudic ethical tract Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, which echoes Kohelet's ideas of the importance of living wisely. That is, according to our best guess of what God expects of us down here under the sun. Be bold as a leopard, as light as an eagle, as swift as a gazelle, and as brave as a lion to do the will of your Father in heaven. Kohelet warns his students to avoid hazardous behavior and instead pursue wise, careful self-conduct. He contrasts two metaphorical images of women current in his day to sketch the tug-of-war between wisdom and foolishness. Now, this is often assumed to be a bit of misogyny, this passage, but I would suggest that the gendered language itself argues against so literal a reading. Chokhmah, wisdom, the object of Kohelet's search, is, of course, a feminine word. Throughout the book of Proverbs, which is roughly contemporary with Kohelet, wisdom is characterized as a woman, a teacher, and a model for all humankind. Indeed, Proverbs ends with the famous Eshet Chayil, a woman of strength, a paean to the wise and capable mother, homemaker, and businesswoman, all faces of Lady Wisdom. Conversely, Kohelet warns of the dangers of temptation by reckless, illicit women, characterized in Proverbs 9 by the feminine gender, ksilut, of the same word, ksil, that Kohelet continually applies to his negative role model. At the page at the left, two micrographic texts contrast the two symbolic women. The wise woman at far right gathers her fruit, household keys dangling from her waist. She is composed of Eshet Chayil and verses from Proverbs 9, all praising Lady Wisdom. Now, at the left of the painting, a dancing woman, such as one might have seen at evening entertainments in the Alhambra, rattles the tambourine. She is composed of the aria Libiamo in the first act of Verdi's La Traviata, the interchange between the courtesan Violetta and Alfredo Germont. In contrast to the wise and prudent woman across the page, these soon-to-be lovers sing to each other about how life is all about embracing the pleasure of the moment. Now, this is a good place to show you another image that appears here and, in fact, on every painting. I've got a close-up down here. You can see a small honeybee in each painting. My name, Dvorah, is the Hebrew word for honeybee, and although I do indeed keep bees nowadays, since long before that, placing a bee in each painting has been my play with the medieval colophon identifying a scribe. Here, Kohelet has moved on to consider the difficulties of a person of integrity serving a corrupt ruler. I live in Washington, D.C. The illuminations offer cautionary images for both the arrogant ruler and the honest courtier. We see a painting of a marble statue of justice pulling down her blindfold and winking. In contrast, the bordering calligraphy offers the very passage, "Justice, justice you shall pursue," from Deuteronomy 16, that famously requires the ruler to pursue honest and even-handed justice for all people. The English text begins with a painting showing a crown lying in a gutter, a cautionary tale inspired by both Napoleon's remark about the crown of France lying in the gutter and George Patton's observation that at Roman generals' triumph parades, a slave stood behind the conqueror, holding a golden crown and whispering in his ear, a warning that all glory is fleeting. The decorative text bordering the English page illustrates the dangers attendant upon the honest courtier with Cordelia's speech from the beginning of King Lear. Lots of Shakespeare in here. And finally, Kohelet arrives at the answer to his search for wisdom. His royal avatar gazes out at his orderly farmland and catches sight of a small but wise farmer working the land, dividing it into areas for different treatment. Some wither and some flourish. Cast thy bread upon the water, he says, for thou shalt find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 and even to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. So take your chances, make contingency plans. Some will go awry, but some will flourish. This is the key to survival, to fulfillment in all your labors, and to wisdom. As he muses, his hand rests beside his beloved's, while the olives symbolize both his nobility and his growing family, the pomegranate branch, their fruitfulness, and the bottle of wine, both his sanctification of God and his joy. Kohelet has found the elusive secret to a meaningful life beneath the unknowable heaven. We're nearing the end of Kohelet's reflections, the gentle and poetic ode to death. You may recognize the Talmudic motto, know before whom you stand, da lifnei mi'ata omed, that crowns the grand portal to this palace, just as it has crowned the Holy Ark in synagogues across the centuries. All of the diverse and busy lives lived in the palace, whether child or adult, labor or scholar or aristocrat, all paths lead away from the sunlit courtyard toward shadow, oblivion, and certain divine judgment. We find a fragile elderly laborer lugging a basket of grapes destined for a rich table, pregnant women celebrating each other's joy, children and aristocrats, and then in the distance, an old man hobbles into the inescapable misty darkness at the end of the grand halls. Even the solid stone palace is ephemeral. The golden bowl of the courtyard fountain not only sprays, but also leaks the water that is essential to human life. Weeds have invaded the meticulously laid courtyard tiles, and the intricate mosaics have begun to crumble. The almond tree is heavy with fragrant white blossoms, likely a contemporary idiom for the white hair of old age. Nothing in the palace of human existence, even in this grandest of palaces, lasts forever. So what does last forever, if not human accomplishment? Only God. And Kohelet begins his paean to the end of human life under the sun by warning us to live constantly aware of the inevitability of divine judgment of our personal actions. And the courtyard of this palace is filled with exhortations to live mindful of divine law. The pomegranate tree reminds the courtiers of fertility, and we see pregnant women and the fruits of all humankind's labor. But the pomegranate's many seeds also symbolize the 613 commandments. Midrashic associations with a pink lily at its root reminds them of the value of the 10 Commandments in the corrupt human world. And the thorny rose climbing its trunk recalls the humility of the burning bush. The grass that springs up between the courtyard tiles suggests the warning that occurs throughout biblical texts, that sinners will vanish like dry grass. As throughout Jewish lore, the water that sprays from the fountain also symbolizes the necessity of Torah to humankind throughout our lives under the sun. Far beneath the heavens, night falls over the palace of the philosopher king. The golden bowl framing the scene has finally cracked. Now, shortly before painting these, I happened upon a book of poetry reflecting on Kohelet, composed by the first of the two 11th century Jewish grand viziers who ruled in Granada, Shmuel HaNagid. One beautiful poem surrounds the text page, expressing the poet's determination to pursue life despite its transience. It's very short. Let me read it to you. Soul opens inside you on beauty, and then tells you to seek in the world and ignore its flaws. Heart says you'll live forever, and death, as it speaks, grasps you with its claws. Kohelet's last words rest within fig branches across the 4 seasons. Throughout Jewish lore, figs embody many qualities of Israel, humankind, and the world. Here, they hint at the birth and passing of generations and the goodness of divine law. The oak branch bears the acorns that are the oak's future. This image alludes to Israel's strength to endure, despite the passing of every individual, of even the Davidic kingdom itself. Isaiah prophesied that Israel would be reborn after conquest like the terebinth and the oak, of which stumps are left even when they are felled. Its stump shall be a holy seed. Like the oak's seed and regenerating stump, long after his own death, Qohelet's words continue to offer humankind guidance toward a realistic yet meaningful life. Oh my goodness. Why is this not? Oh my goodness, there's supposed to be one more slide after this, and it didn't make it in, and I apologize for that. So, thank you.
The last slide was supposed to be how to obtain the book, right?
Yes, it was.
Okay. So you can do that.
Actually, you know what?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's here on this page, but I'm not getting there. It's not, the machine's
So tell
not
us,
there.
tell us.
Okay, so Amazon has royally screwed this up. We have been fighting. Our publisher, Baylor, has been fighting with Amazon for months. So the best way of getting it is actually from Baylor University Press itself. And if you go to my website, which is dbandart.com, you will find there a link to it on Baylor's website and a discount code for a very nice discount, and I'm pretty certain free shipping. Barnes & Noble is also has it with free shipping. So it's around. And we just received a note today that the Harvard bookstore in Harvard Square has it in their front window.
Ooh,
so, yes.
Excellent. Okay, let's take a couple of questions before we call it quits. Anybody have anything? I know those of you who are watching this after the fact from afar, it's hard for us to take your questions, but anybody, comment, question? So, I mean, the question I asked you beforehand when we were having dinner was, like, how do you create a rich visual field of representations relating to a text that's often abstract? But you answered my question, in abundance, so I don't need to ask it anymore.
It came out, everything flowed once I hit on the note. I mean, the palace metaphor is something I work with all the time. But once I hit upon the notion of using the Alhambra, oh my goodness, everything flowed. Mm-hmm. So,
and just one more thing. I also want to ask, and if either of you have a sense of this, after this talk was scheduled, I actually was approached by another author who has just published a translation and commentary on Kohelet, asking if he could do a book talk. And I said, well, we've already got your book. We've already got it published. Let's talk about it maybe sometime next year. But I think there's great interest in this book. Do you have a sense of why so much of attention is directed at it?
What shall I say? The key to Kohelet, to the way I read Kohelet, is the Mishnah in Yadayim, which gives a mythologized account of its canonization. And the giveaway phrase is that this is associated with the Hillelite position. Okay, Beit Hillel, okay, ruled sheKohelet metameh et hayadayim, that Kohelet should be sacred, and Beit Shammai would have liked Kohelet not to enter the canon. And the way, as you well know, David, the way I read the Hillelite voice of the Talmud is precisely that reading of Kohelet which I propose. In other words, The Talmudic literature has two great undertakings, midrashic, interpretive, and halachic. And it is totally, but totally, read my lips here at JTS, indifferent to the very idea of truth. Okay? Nobody in the Talmudic literature denies the divine origin of Scripture, but nobody would claim that they have got God's word right. The recurring term in the Midrashic literature from wall to wall is davar acher, davar acher, davar acher, and they're never adjudicated. So this very notion that God, excuse the phrase, God cannot control his message. Why? Because it's always filtered and refracted through the diverse, time-bound, culture-bound, language-bound lenses of its various readers. And therefore, so what is a worthwhile life of Torah? Precisely that. Lehagdil Torah v'lehadir. And the same goes for halakha. Halakha isn't ruled. It has to be decided, right? But it's decided by prosaic majority vote. It's not because anybody claims to have hit on Da'at Torah, right? In the Talmudic literature.
Until much later, right?
Till much later. And the Bavli opens every such decision with, again, a variety of readings which are never adjudicated. Never adjudicated. And the dialogue of the Bavli is not meant to reach an agreement or consensus, but to play positions off against each other, to be enriched and developed in ways that you could never achieve by talking to yourself. And this is the wisdom of Qohelet. And the minute you read Qohelet through that lens, not only the key passages sort of suddenly make sense and key images, but the book reads as a sustained argument, chasing this idea through theology and politics and so on and so forth, and especially epistemology and the notion of a life worth living, of a worthy human life under the sun, with God breathing down your neck, but without you ever being able to, ascertain or make certain what he wants from you. And therefore, anyhow, so, this is my reading, and it suddenly emerges as the key biblical text for the Talmud, and a text that, of course, doesn't mention covenant, mitzvah, or prophecy, because before you can open the other 23 books, you have to, reach a conclusion about what a human reading can amount to, and then open the book with a diversity of readings and so on and so forth. So, that's the long answer to your very short question.
Ben.
So a question about Asot Sfarim or Asot Sefer. I'm kind of wondering about the process. To what extent were you guys in dialogue? To what extent do the illustrations reflect Menachem's reading? To what extent was your reading influenced by or refracted through your viewing? I don't know, did you view the illustrations or early versions of the illustration? In other words, in a sense, when I'm also reading for the reader of the book, to what extent is there a dialogue? To what extent is this book harmonious? And to what extent is this book, like some readings of Kohelet, disharmonious and perhaps deliberately so?
We worked together quite closely, and my interpretation of Kohelet is based directly upon what Menachem did. I didn't start painting until Menachem was well along the way with his interpretation, beyond where he had taken it with that first article that I read. He saw the paintings as I was going, but I tended to develop, we spoke together as he was drafting each section of his commentary, each chapter of his commentary, and then I worked with those ideas. He finalized it later on, But I had the basic ideas he was working with, and that helped guide me in my interpretation. So it was completely hand in glove in that way, but I developed my imagery reasonably separately. I think there were a couple of times that I checked with him to make sure I wasn't going way off field. But
if you read the introduction to the book started out, from my point of view, many, many years ago, many years before Debbie and I began talking about this, with a real machloket, with my father's reading of Qohelet in his book, Poetry with a Purpose, as an ironical text. And that was a real machloket. I mean, this was a real friendly disagreement. I still think his essay is one of the best written on Qohelet, and I think it's wrong. And it's that idea of disagreeing with something which is good. And I think he had the same sort of attitude towards my reading. So that was a sort of Talmudic machloket. With Debra, it's different. We're reading this book across a divide, not of different readings, but different visualizations or different articulations, refracted through very different media. What I can add is that philosophers very often have difficulty writing simple. And there was something about the visualizations of which enabled me to Debra knows how many versions of my texts and commentaries went through in order to make them more personal and more accessible. And I think discussing or rather articulating my view, rewording my view in the light of the way Debra visualized the text allowed me not to dumb down the philosophy, but to clarify and make for an easier read without surrendering depth. Now, for me, this is very difficult to do. I write for philosophers. I don't write popular works. I'm absolutely no good at it. But I think my writing here is accessible, is more accessible than anything I've written. And I owe this to the conversation across the media, I think, with Debra.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I want to thank you for coming, those of you who are here. Those of you who are watching, thanks for also following up with this wonderful conversation. And in addition to just simply educating us, educating all of us, I hope this leads to some sales of the book, because I know that's an author's interest as well. I do want to say that this is one part of as I said at the beginning, mostly online series that the library sponsors. We have got a wonderful book talk scheduled for next Tuesday, the 24th of October. The book is by Rosa Loewinger. It's called Dwell Time. Rosa is a Cuban Jew whose life began in Havana and escaped with her family to Florida. And this book reflects in poetic ways on the relationship between her life, a Jew from Cuba, and her life's work, which is the preservation, conservation, restoration of artworks, of sculpture, of architecture. And the library is interested in both of those things, both Jewish experience, and we have an active conservation department. So when this book came to our attention, we said, great. It ticks both of these things. It's a wonderful book, and I invite you to join us online for that, either next Tuesday night or after the fact, because we make all of our book talks available on our website. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.